Some films were harmed in the making of this podcast. Hey everybody, and welcome back for another episode of For Your Consideration, the podcast featuring roundtable discussions reevaluating the cinematic canon of past masterpieces and modern classics. I'm Mike Josick.
And I'm Dustin Friesenan.
Thanks for joining us. Well, I have to say, it's a little disorienting and also kind of refreshing. I'm still recovering, I think, from October and November.
Even if November was your choice.
November was my choice.
Though I'll take the blame a year and a month in advance for October.
And it's great that we're in December and we don't have to do an entire month of like Christmas movies.
Because luckily, there aren't really Christmas masterpieces.
And we've already done...
A Muppet Christmas Carol notwithstanding.
And we've already done It's a Wonderful Life. And that's technically not really a Christmas movie. It's just sort of been adopted as a Christmas movie.
Thanks to money, which is what Christmas is really all about these days. So I'm not too sure why people are so upset that we're splitting it off into happy holidays and Christmas when, quite frankly, what Christmas has become, I'd want to separate myself out a little bit from that.
But we're happy to be here. We're happy to be talking...
about movies set in 10th century feudal Japan.
Happy to be talking about movies set anywhere right now. But yeah, this week's movie, it's actually a movie we've had on the list for quite some time, and we were kind of glad to finally get around to a film by Akira Kurosawa. I do believe this is the first Japanese film.
To the best of my terrible recollection, anyway.
We've done a French movie.
Swedish, Spanish, Korean.
Yeah, we held off on the Japanese horror movies because that is maybe next year for our October Fright Fest.
Brazilian.
So yeah, this is our first Japanese movie, our first film by Akira Kurosawa, and the film that we're covering this week is Rashomon.
AKA that movie that shows us just what real sword fighting would look like. AKA that movie about the worst Pokemon.
Which one is the worst Pokemon?
Rashomon.
So let's roll credits on this movie and we'll get to the discussion portion of the podcast. Rashomon was directed by Akira Kurosawa. It was produced by Minoru Jingo. Screenplay was by Akira Kurosawa and Shinobu Hashimoto. It was based on In a Grove by Ryunosuke Akutagawa. It starred Toshiro Mifune, Michiko Kayu, Masayuki Mori, Takashi Shimura, and Minoru Chaki. Music was by Fumio Hayasaka. Cinematography was by Kazuo Miyagawa. It was edited by Akira Kurosawa, distributed by Daiei Film, and released on August 25th, 1950. Rashomon is a much lauded film in the, 67 odd years that it's been around. It's made a ton of best of lists, 1001 movies you must see before you die. It's 22nd on Empire Magazine's 100 Best Films of World Cinema, and 290th on their 500 Greatest Movies of All Time.
And one of our highest ranked movies we've done, it ranks 24th on the Critics Poll for the Greatest Films of All Time on Sight and Sound, and 18th on the Directors Poll.
Also, Woody Allen included it among his top 10 films, but nobody really cares what he thinks anymore. So, Dustin, this was the first time that you have seen Rashomon. What did you think? Before you say what you think, you know what? I was so tempted. Time got in the way of it, but I really wanted to do a Rashomon-style podcast where we came at it from different directions. But just logistically, it was impossible. So
instead, we'll have to do a back and forth conversation instead of have everything I say in one part, everything you say, and everything is lies.
And unless you can do that on the fly, what did you think of your first viewing of Rashomon?
You've definitely distracted me with the concept of doing a podcast where we just lie about the movies for a while. I don't.
You kind of want to, right?
Kinda, but I'd see that if you want to have the truth eventually come out, man, that would be a long episode. And I think a lot of you would be bored out of your skulls by the time that happened. But getting to the actual film, it took me a little bit to get into it, especially since the first, 10 minutes is Somebody walking?
Very nearly, yes.
Very nearly. And I had a basic idea as to what to expect from the film, since while we were watching The Punisher, you were talking about the Rashomon style episode where you hear a couple different stories from different perspectives and you see what's going on in that perspective. Now I know sort of potentially the originator. I don't know of any earlier sources for that kind of...
I think it's widely held that while it has been sort of adopted culturally, we recognize those sorts of stories, those multi-layered, multiplicity kind of stories as Rashomon style. Akira Kurosawa was building on, narrative storytelling that had come before him. And it was just, he was there at the right time in the right place and kind of popularized it as far as, I think it made such an impact on Western audiences that it just stuck.
Friggin' white people deciding everything, as per usual. But what I noticed at the end was I actually wasn't too sure exactly what he was going for in terms of what the overall morality was. You have the priest who's talking about a lack of faith in humanity. Just this story has traumatized the crap out of him. He's done. Like, he's not sure he can really go on. And they're sitting there sort of jaws to the ground just trying to deal with this story. And the first thing I thought was, this story is not going to be anything near deserving this reaction. Especially since they're talking about how, whatever, you look up on top of this gate, there's probably 5 or 6 unclaimed dead bodies. I mean, people are going around murdering and pillaging every day. What could possibly be in this story that's so much worse? And I agreed. What could possibly be in this story that's so much worse?
I do think it's a little hyperbolic the way they're so bowled over by it, but I think the fact that you have the story of the woodcutter, you have the story of the priest, while they're giving their testimony, you get the testimony of the woman, you get the testimony of the dead husband.
Via medium.
And I think those are the things that are kind of blowing them away. I think, I'm guessing in 10th century Japan, this this kind of thing probably would throw you for a bit of a loop. I think in 10th century anywhere, you might be thrown for a loop by this kind of murder and duplicity. And I mean, one of the great things about this movie, in my opinion, is that you never really know what happens. And I think you were kind of saying, what was the point of sort of the priest's reaction at the end?
No, the point of the priest's reaction, I understand that. I'm just saying that it was extremely hyperbolic at the beginning, and that kind of threw me off a little bit.
But you were saying the whole thing about his, having lost faith in humanity.
He was talking about that at the beginning.
I totally don't remember that. It really sticks with me at the end because that's kind of the punctuation on the whole theme of the movie, right? Like, the rain is supposed to be unpleasant. It's supposed to represent the unpleasantness of the world. The story that you get about this bandit who is lacking in ethics and is basically almost like an animal. You have this nobleman who is kind of a coward.
Well, depending on whose story.
Depending on whose story, but and then you have this woman who, again, depending on whose story, she's either complicit or she's a victim, but there's a rape, there's a murder,
and the fact that those happen never changes.
No, but I think just the unpleasantness of that situation, you're looking at, and also the people telling the story who are not necessarily telling the truth. So you have all of these people sort of being unpleasant and unethical, and there's this whole swath of, the world is shitty and terrible, and then at the end, when the woodcutter, there's the innocent baby who the common man goes and he steals the kimono off of it and is basically going, somebody else would, so why don't I? And the priest is kind of lost all faith in humanity, and the woodcutter, who is at this point in the story, we're not sure if he's actually complicit, because there's the whole question about the dagger and the sword and what he saw and didn't see and what he contributed to and didn't contribute to. But at the end he goes, I'm going to take the baby. And the priest is like, no, you're not going to take advantage of this like the other guy. He's like, no, I have 6 kids. What's one more? Let me take this child. Let me take care of this child. And the rain stops and the sun comes out, which is
the redeeming moment for the priest.
It's a redeeming moment where, the world is not so unpleasant, and here is an example of somebody who's actually not doing something to benefit themselves or to hurt others, but to actually benefit somebody else. at their expense. And that's when the priest is like, I've regained my faith. And that's one of the more interesting things for me. Like, you mentioned the Punisher episode, and we knew that we were going to get around to talking this at some point, but the way that the Rashomon style has been adopted by Western storytellers, and we have tons of TV shows and animated series, like so many shows have their Rashomon episode, and the Punisher had its Rashomon episode. And the thing about this movie is that it's not just about he said, she said. The stories and the differences in the stories, you know, we don't necessarily have clean closure at the end. It's not like one person's story explained everything and then the police could come in and arrest somebody, or, you know, the Punisher knows who to shoot, or, you know, whatever it is. It's a means to an end, like feeding into this thematic story that Kurosawa is telling. I think the way it's been adopted by other storytellers is much more gimmicky, and
like certainly in the Punisher episode, it was the governor is lying, flat out lying just to save his own ass. Then the reporter is telling the truth. It's nice, clear cut and simple like that. The only real issue is that she can't tell the whole truth to the police because they're not going to believe her, blah, 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 blah. But when it comes to Rashomon here, I do believe that the woodcutter is telling the truth. In here, every one of them commits sin. And usually it's and it's entirely to benefit themselves. The bandit, he knows he's caught. All he's concerned about is looking badass and honorable. His big lies are that he lets the guy out in order to sword fight him because that is the honorable way to kill this guy. And he talks about how great the sword fight was. Our swords clashed 23 times. I remember because the last person who's like second place here, he only clashed swords with me 20 times. So he's very concerned with his own image. And then you look at the woman's story, and she's also concerned with her own image in a roundabout way. Yes, she was defiled. Yes, she killed her husband, but have pity upon me and still take care of me. That's her sort of primary concern there, is to garner the sympathy of others. Then you have the medium. I'm going to trust that it's not a fake story from the medium, that it is the husband.
I think that's one of the most interesting parts of the movie, is how to take the testimony of the husband. Do you take it as like bullshit, or do you take it as
I'm taking it
stone
as
cold
face
truth?
Value.
And I do too. But I think it's an interesting thing in the movie to have where everybody else is lying, and then you have like this weird, surreal, supernatural element.
But the husband himself is also there to look honorable. He commits seppuku in order to save face, which is something that became an issue with the institution of the Bushido Code of Honor, which was pretty much a load of horse crock in order to get soldiers to act a certain way during World War II to unite them, but has really, as we all know, blown a bit out of proportion. But that's neither here nor there. And then you have the woodcutter. Now, his whole part is that I believe his story is true, that is exactly what happened. But his sin wasn't lying, it was lying by omission. He didn't want to get involved. And so what that leaves me with is you have this notion of he's supposed to be the good man, given the priest's reaction to him at the end as he takes the child, which I believe he does out of guilt more than any real desire to be good. But he has the chance to stand up, to tell the truth, to be honest, and he doesn't take it. And it honestly keeps making me think back to any quote about Hitler's rise to power, and how if good men do nothing, then evil triumphs, sort of deal.
But the question with the woodcutter is, why doesn't he come forward?
He doesn't want to be involved. He doesn't want the attention. He doesn't want all this stuff on him. He specifically states that, and that's where the lie comes from. And if you look at any quote like I just said, good men don't want to get involved. They don't want to have all this difficulty. They don't want this drama. And I know so many people who tell me to avoid getting involved in things because it's difficult. It's not your business. This, that, the other. Every excuse in the book to not do good.
But you don't listen.
I don't listen. The woodcutter, however, does listen. And that is where I think he is sinful as well with these people. He has the story. He doesn't even tell it outside of earshot of all the other people involved. He could just tell his story and go on, but he chose to lie for really little reason as far as I'm concerned.
See, I read a little more...
Except that he might have that dagger that they might start asking questions about.
That's what I was going to say, where...
Once again,
I read into it
guilt.
a little bit. He points out that he was killed with a sword, not a dagger. There's little details that he knows that he also doesn't really want to elaborate on. And that usually, even after he's told his story, like it does raise suspicions. It raises questions. But I do like your read of it.
And looking at that, you can see that everybody else was full of bluster. All of them were cowards. The bandit was definitely cowardly, tried to find a woman via rape, which is total bullshit. The husband...
And still done to this day.
That would be a whole big long conversation.
That's a different podcast.
That is. And the husband denounces his wife because she slept with another man against her will, and that's a load of horseshit that happens to this day for sure. And the woman, she does whatever she can. She turns them against each other in order to find someone who's actually going to take care of her. She's unhappy with her husband and was hoping that this powerful bandit she's heard about could actually give her some excitement, some sort of life. So everyone is just miserable liars.
And that's one of the things that I really like about this movie is that depending on who's telling the story, like Tajumaru is like loud and childlike and screaming and maniacal, or he's, you know, strong.
Funny enough,
and
that's in his story where he's screaming and laughing maniacally like an idiot.
And like these characters there isn't, other than maybe the husband, who has no name other than the samurai. Other than maybe the husband, there is no character who has like any sort of real consistency as far as the storytelling goes. And it's something I really appreciated about the narrative is that who was telling the story and who they were talking about mattered insofar as how that story played out, because everybody was portrayed slightly differently by every storyteller.
Pretty much the only consistency with him is that he shied away from his wife immediately, like a dick.
Yeah, and that 1,000-yard stare that he gives her is pretty much consistent in every story, including his.
Including his. He doesn't want to fight for her. He's like, well, this is my excuse. This is my out. That is a marriage that is on the rocks, people.
What did you think of the... Apparently, Kurosawa, when approaching this movie with his cinematographer, he instructed him that he wanted to make a movie that was reminiscent of silent film. So much of the reactions of the characters and the staging and the lighting, it has that silent film feel. In fact, so much of the film is silent. I mean, you mentioned it takes like 10 minutes for something to kind of actually happen. That whole walk of the woodcutter through the woods, like it takes some time. It's several minutes worth of just walking. It's really great at setting the tone and setting the mood, and it's not really telling you anything other than just giving you a sort of space to exist in and showing you this environment. And the environment itself, it's very leafy, it's very covered, the sunlight, the light, which is symbolic in the movie and comes in at the end as kind of that moment of sort of revelation or whatever. You know, light is knowledge. It's obscured through the whole film.
Honestly, what I saw was they're talking about how there's all these wars of bandits, all this death and violence around them. I saw peace and serenity in those woods pretty much at all times. Even when they're scrambling and fighting each other, all I could think was that it was isolated from everything else. That this is an isolated event happening in a much larger world. The police, where they're trying to tell the story, I found it very odd that you didn't hear anything from the police themselves. They never appeared on screen, fine, but...
Well, there was the one guy who found...
The character would always repeat what the policeman said. Huh? My sword? Well, I did this. What guy that found?
Well, it was a policeman that found Tajumaru.
Well, beyond...
He gives the testimony.
Beyond witness testimony, you don't hear anybody that they're actually talking to. I'm wondering if that was supposed to be us that they're explaining this to?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, they're obviously talking to some sort of...
Tribunal or
something. Yeah. But
that even
Kurosawa has staged it so that you are the tribunal.
But that area feels clean. The ruins that they have, it seems very open. That's the sense that I got from the film. A big openness.
That's really interesting because, I mean, there is that kind of grove where everything happens, but the grove is enclosed in foliage and you have to walk through trees and stuff to get there. And when he takes the husband samurai to go look for swords, it's all trees and brush and he's cutting through. I mean, there's a lot of natural obfuscation kind of going on. But yeah, like most of the events of the incident happen within that grove, which is kind of open. There's nothing really concealing within that space, which could also thematically say something.
Assuming that's what it was going for. And I'm not just a crazy person.
I do think it's fair to say that Kurosawa was the type of filmmaker who did everything on purpose.
Oh, I'm not saying he didn't. Just that it might have been something else completely he was going for, and I'm looking at it wrong, according to him.
I don't think you are. I mean, just judging by sort of the traditional view of this film by film critics and historians and whatnot, like...
Of which I know nothing.
Yeah, that's actually another thing that I really liked about this experience going into this movie, is that I've seen it a few times. I even got to see it in the theater once, which was fantastic. This was your first time, so there are things that I'm probably, I've thought about them and I've worked through meanings and things, and you're just kind of coming to it cold.
And then talking about it cold.
I probably had a more sort of clunky reaction to it initially, like you did.
Thanks, sir.
Because there are things about it that, occasionally, like I said, there's inconsistencies with the way the characters are portrayed. There's the long stretches with no dialogue. Even the music, which, nothing wrong with the music.
The music does feel a lot more silent film, since it's a lot more predominant than you would see in others.
And there's, apparently Kurosawa had said to the composer at one point, he wanted a piece for, like, the walking through the woods, the woodcutter. He wanted a piece like Ravel's Bolero, but that wasn't Ravel's Bolero. So the composer did his best to give him a version of Ravel's Bolero. So it's like a very familiar music cue.
Which might become more familiar 67 years of other composers being told, I want something like the woodcutters walk through the woods. But as I was saying earlier, like, what's the overall theme that he's going for, the overall message when it comes to good versus evil, honor versus lies, and all that, given that the woodcutter himself is deeply flawed, but you have the priest regaining his faith from that woodcutter's actions? Is it just that there's that one good action, period, even from a flawed man? Or is the flawed man supposed to be represented as good? Is where I find my little disconnect.
Actually, there's a moment in the film where the medium is giving the testimony of the dead husband. And the dead husband is talking about his demise. And as he's talking about his demise through the medium, the shot, like so many other shots in this movie, and it's something I want to touch on right after we finish talking about this, it's a 3-shot. You've got the woodcutter and the priest in the background, and you've got the medium in the foreground. You can see the woodcutter getting visibly uncomfortable with the description of the events. It's another reason why I kind of wonder if there was more going on with the woodcutter, if he was more complicit in events than was perhaps, made clear by the end of the film. But it was, I don't know if you noticed that. You may have been watching the medium like I probably did the first time I saw the movie.
Bandy about like a loon, yes.
Okay.
Though I don't know how much more complicit he could be, given that nobody even knew that he was there, and everyone basically admits to the murder at the same time, which is probably the biggest suspicious part.
But I think there might be some idea that, like, what if the woodcutter found the husband still tied up, and he's the one that killed him to take his stuff? And maybe Tajumaru had taken off, and maybe the wife had taken off, just left him there.
Though Tajumaru admits to taking the husband's sword and selling it.
But everybody's lying.
Everybody's lying. This is where stuff gets a bit trickier.
And I think it's something that really rewards you on multiple viewings.
But I would say, if you're going to take the medium's account at face value, why on earth would he not say, yeah, and then this jerk came by and stabbed me with my wife's dagger? Unless it's entirely to
if
save face.
He was trying to save
like,
face, yeah.
I didn't lose a sword fight because I'm too awesome, first off, even though I was kidnapped.
He's like, I didn't die like a punk tied up on the ground.
Stabbed myself.
Now, the thing I wanted to touch
even though my best friend wasn't around to cut off my head afterwards. I forgot that part.
The thing I wanted to touch on that I just mentioned about the 3-shot. This is about sort of 3 main stories. There's
4 with the woodcutters.
There's a love triangle. There's a triangle. Let's not say it's a love triangle. So many of the shots, even with the common man, the woodcutter, and the priest.
And then later the baby.
Yeah, and like the common man leaves, then the baby's there. But so many shots framed with 3 actors. Was that anything that you noticed as well, or?
No, even though you mentioned it midway through the movie, talking about how he does everything in 3s, I specifically started looking for anything that you might mention in 3s and point out more going on there. such as the 3 stories becoming 4, the 3 people at the temple becoming 4 people at the temple, just one's in the back. Yes, pretty much everything is shot with 3 people in frame, but more people are involved.
You could also
That's
argue...
mostly me just being a spiteful asshole, though.
You could also argue that Kurosawa himself is telling a story, so he himself is telling a version.
A story of a story. Nolan stole Inception from Kurosawa.
Nolan stolen.
Except we all know the truth.
This has been certified Nolan stolen.
Nolan stole Inception from DuckTales, as we all know. So we'll just drop that now.
And when we turn this recording off, you're going to explain that to me.
Oh, I'll show you the comic. It's amazing.
So I don't know if there's anything really more to go on about here. Do you have any feelings that you want to get out before we get into our judgment phase?
I believe that I got it all pretty much down there.
All right. Did you want to start with the summation? Masterpiece or museum piece?
At the end of the day, looking at this film, there is a lot going for it. I definitely think that it is well shot. The rain, I thought, was beautiful. I would love to just be outside in that kind of rain.
Do you want to know how they did it?
How did they do it?
They got the Japanese fire department out there. Probably every fire department. So much water. And the water still wasn't showing up on camera, so they had to inject black ink into it. And you can actually see in some scenes when the water is dripping down the actors' faces that there's some black streaks. They went to a lot of trouble to get that water that heavy and that visible on camera.
And it worked. And that water was glorious. If you're ever out in the woods camping or at a cabin and that's the kind of rain you got, it is amazing.
And if running water makes you have to go to the bathroom, maybe take care of that before watching this movie.
Don't drink 3 large pops. It's not going to work out nicely for you. But even though it is beautifully shot and there's a lot going on that is very interesting, I find that at the end of the day, it did not really grab me. It didn't have an entirely clear direction that I saw anyway, when it comes to what they're talking about when it comes to ethics, and a lot of that could be cultural stuff that I'm absolutely missing, because this is 1950s Japan versus me here in 2017 North America.
1950s Japan telling a 10th century Japanese story.
Exactly. So I'm going to get distracted by the dumbass eyebrows on the medium and the lady, and I'm going to miss a lot of culturally relevant stuff in their behavior, such as why I did not like Pride and Prejudice, since I didn't hear later on that that's not how women acted, so she was acting really out of sorts. I just thought, oh, this is the only normal person in the friggin' book. Basically, it's not exactly a universal story. It's not something we can come back to in a lot of future generations and really grasp everything that's going on. A classic, 100%. So a museum piece, for sure. But a masterpiece, I'm going to get myself a lot of flack and say, I don't think so.
And this is where we will agree to disagree, because I'm going to side with a masterpiece for all of the reasons that I've already stated in the podcast. Prior to this, the direction, the cinematography, the composition. The only thing that I didn't really care for was the music, but it's pretty typical of 1950s sort of film music. I didn't think it was terrible. I just thought it was the least element of an otherwise really interestingly put together movie. And the use of close-up and long shots and the lighting through the trees and the camera work, the way the camera would move with the characters and the perspectives, everything feeding into everything else. And,
beautifully shot, absolutely.
And and this kind of universal theme and this multi-layered idea which has infected narrative storytelling for half a century since. I
will say, though, that I did have a hard time trying to figure out what side of the fence I was going to fall.
I honestly thought, I figured masterpiece before I went in, and then, because so often we've sat down and I've thought, oh, I know exactly what this is going to be, and then I don't, because I watch it and I'm like, oh my god, how am I going to go on this? It was pretty clear to me from, I don't know, the first 15 minutes, I was like, yeah, we're doing masterpiece. This movie is going to have to fuck up really badly for me to go any less than masterpiece. So, yeah, and I don't even necessarily think that this is Kurosawa's crowning achievement. So I'm pretty sure that we're going to be revisiting this filmmaker, and we're going to be bestowing
proper honors upon him.
Some proper honors. We may even agree. So that's 1 vote for Masterpiece and 1 vote for Museum Piece for Rashomon.
And before we head out here, we are going to do some shout-outs to all of you lovely listeners who shouted us.
Yeah, there's been so much activity once again on the YouTube page
that we don't want to bother all of you poor people who actually do listen to us with 10 minutes worth of shout-outs at the beginning.
And just in reference to the Close Encounters episode last week, Garrett, we're glad you enjoyed it, and we clearly made your day, even though we didn't necessarily rate it all unicorns and rainbows. So glad you like that.
Honesty is how we roll here. We are not sycophants.
God, there's so many on the thing.
And the Underhood, talking about Starship Troopers 2. We got somebody else finally on our side for actually enjoying the film.
And we had Ingo Film Freak commenting on the first Starship Troopers. He apparently liked it so much he subscribed. So that's pretty cool.
And of course to Just Drive Motorsports, Aaron A., Richard Connolly, and Jimmy David, Real Cull, and Swagsuke Uchiha, and Byron Raver for keeping the conversation going on The Thing.
Which remains our most popular episode.
Best movie, which is one of the things that a lot of people are shouting out.
And I was pleased to see a comment on our Duck Soup episode by Brock Fraser. And David Griffith commented on our Alien episode. Glad you liked the review. And to bring it all back to our Close Encounters episode to end our shoutouts, thanks Donaldos Mister for listening to the show.
And I hope that gas mask fits your dog properly.
So that's the shoutouts for this week. Thanks again to everybody who took the time to A, listen to the show, and B, let us know anything. For anybody else who wants to give us a shoutout or comment on Rashomon or whatever, we're available on all the social media. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter,
Libsyn, WordPress.
Follow, share, subscribe.
153rd Street.
If you get the show off of iTunes, downloading or streaming, rate and review the show while you're there. We'd appreciate it. And we have a Patreon campaign currently going on, so you can check us out at patreon.com/FYC show. Find out what kind of cool stuff we have over there.
And let us know if there's a movie that you think we should put under the spotlight, the limelight.
It's true. If we've proven anything, we've proven we will watch and rate your movie.
Bring it on.
So thanks again for joining us. This has been For Your Consideration, talking about Rashomon. Next week, I believe, is Titanic week. No, next week is Two Towers.
We will be having Kat back on the show and looking at the second part of the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
As promised when we did Fellowship of the Ring, we will continue, we will finish the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
Even if it takes us another year.
We will not do the Hobbit trilogy. But yeah, it's going to be awesome having Kat back. It was so fun having her the first time around, so looking forward to that, man. So Two Towers next week, Titanic the week after that, Christmas after that. Be sure to join us. I've been your host, Mike.
And I'm Dustin.
Take care.
Ta-ta. AKA that movie that shows us just what real sword fighting would look like. It's not super funny, but it is probably very accurate.